Africa was the first continent outside of Arabia that Islam spread into in the early 7th century. Almost one-third of the world's Muslim population resides in the continent. Muslims cross current Djibouti, Somalia and Eritrea to seek refuge in present-day Ethiopia during the Hijarat. Most Muslims in Africa are Sunni. The complexity of Islam in Africa is revealed in the various schools of thought, traditions, and voices in many African countries. African Islam is not static and is constantly being reshaped by prevalent social, economic, and political conditions. Generally, Islam in Africa often adapted to African cultural contexts and belief systems, forming Africa's own orthodoxies. It was estimated in 2002 that Muslims constitute 45% of the population of Africa. Islam has a large presence in North Africa, the Horn of Africa, the Swahili Coast, and much of West Africa, with minority but significant immigrant populations in South Africa. Spread of Islam in Africa. On the advice of Muhammad in Rajab Bh. or May 6, 14 AD, 23 Muslims migrated to Abyssinia where they were protected by its king, al-Najashi, who also accepted Islam later. They were followed by 101 Muslims later in the same year. Most of those Muslims returned to Medina in 7H. 628 CE, but some settled in the neighboring Zila, which was at the time part of Bilad al-Barbar. Those that settled later built Masjid al-Qiblatain in 20H. 641 CE. During the reign of Caliph Omar bin al-Khattab, Muslim troops took over current Egypt and conquered current Libya the following year. Muslims then expanded to current Tunisia in 27H. 647 AD. During the reign of the third Muslim caliph, Othman bin Affan, the conquest of North Africa continued under the Umayyad dynasty, taking Algeria by 61H. 680 AD, and Morocco the following year. For the latter, Muslim troops crossed the Strait of Gibraltar to Europe in 711. Islam gained momentum during the 10th century in West Africa with the start of the Almoravids movement on the Senegal River, and as rulers and kings embraced Islam. Islam then spread slowly in much of the continent through trade and preaching. By the 9th century, Muslim sultanates started being established in the Horn of Africa, and by the 12th century the Kilwa Sultanate had spread as far south as Mozambique. Islam only crossed deeper into Malawi and Congo in the second half of the 19th century under the Zanzibar Sultanate. Then the British brought the labour force from India, including some Muslim Indian nationals, to their African colonies towards the end of the 19th and beginning of the 20th centuries. History. The presence of Islam in Africa can be traced to the 7th century, when Muhammad advised a number of his early disciples, who were facing persecution by the pre-Islamic inhabitants of the Mecca, to seek refuge across the Red Sea in Aksum. In the Muslim tradition, this event is known as the first Hijra, or migration. During this first Hijra, some Muslims settled in the city of Zila and built the Masjid al-Qiblatain mosque in 627 CE. This mosque has two Qiblats because it was built before the Prophet switched the Qibla from Jerusalem to Mecca. The coastline of the Horn of Africa became the first safe haven for Muslims and the first place Islam would be practiced outside of the Arabian Peninsula. 7 years after the death of Muhammad, the Arabs advanced toward Africa, and within 2 generations, Islam had expanded across the Horn of Africa and North Africa. In the following centuries, the consolidation of Muslim trading networks, connected by lineage, trade, and Sufi brotherhoods, had reached a crescendo in West Africa, enabling Muslims to wield tremendous political influence and power. During the reign of Umar II, the then governor of Africa, Ismail ibn Abdullah, was said to have won the Berbers to Islam by his just administration. Other early notable missionaries include Abdullah ibn Yasin, who started a movement which caused thousands of Berbers to accept Islam. Similarly, in the Swahili coast, Islam made its way inland, spreading at the expense of traditional African religions. This expansion of Islam in Africa not only led to the formation of new communities in Africa, but it also reconfigured existing African communities and empires to be based on Islamic models. Indeed, in the middle of the 11th century, the Kanem Empire, whose influence extended into Sudan, converted to Islam. At the same time, but more toward West Africa, the reigning ruler of the Bornu Empire embraced Islam. As these kingdoms adopted Islam, the subjects thereafter followed suit. In praising the Africans' zealousness to Islam, the 14th century explorer Ibn Battuta stated that mosques were so crowded on Fridays that unless one went very early, it was impossible to find a place to sit. The history of Islam in Africa and accounts of how the religion spread, especially in North and the Horn of Africa, have always been contentious. Head of Awqaf Africa, London, Sheikh Drive, Abu Abdullah al-Abu has written in his Movements of Islam in Face of the Empires and Kingdoms in Yorubaland claims about the early arrival of Islam in the southwestern Nigeria. He seconded the Arab anthropologist Abduhu Badawi on the argument that the early Muslim missionaries had benefited the works from the fall of Kush in southern Sudan and the prosperity of the politically multicultural Abbasid period in the continent, which, according to him, had created several streams of migration, moving west in the mid-9th century into sub-Saharan Africa. Al-Abu pointed at the popularity and influences of the Abbasid dynasty, the second great dynasty with the rulers carrying the title of Caliph, as fostering peaceful and prosperous migration of the intercultured Muslims from the Nile Valley to Niger, as well as of the Arab traders from the desert to Benue. Al-Abu's claim seems to be in line with the conventional historical view that the conquest of North Africa by the Islamic Umayyad Caliphate between AD 647 to 709 effectively ended Christianity in Africa for several centuries. In the 16th century, the Wadi Empire and the Kingdom of Kano embraced Islam, and later toward the 18th century, the Nigeria-based Sokoto Caliphate led by Usman Dan Fodio exerted considerable effort in spreading Islam. Today, Islam is the predominant religion of the northern half of Africa, mainly concentrated in North Africa, the Horn of Africa and the Sahel, as well as West Africa. Characteristics. Islam has been in Africa for so long since its genesis on the Arabian Peninsula that some scholars have argued that it is a traditional African religion. Although the majority of Muslims in Africa are Sunni or Sufi, the complexity of Islam in Africa is revealed in the various schools of thought, traditions, and voices that constantly contend for dominance in many African countries. Islam in Africa is not static and is constantly being reshaped by prevalent social, economic, and political conditions. Islam in Africa is often adapted to local cultural contexts and belief systems, forming the continent's own orthodoxies. Africans have generally appropriated Islam in both more inclusive ways or in the more radical ways, as with the Almoravid movement. Additionally, Islam in Africa has both local and global dimensions. On the local level, experts assert that Muslims operate with considerable autonomy and do not have an international organization that regulates the religious practices. This fact accounts for the differences and varieties in Islamic practices throughout the African continent. On the global level, Muslims in Africa are also part of the Ummah worldwide Islamic community, and follow global issues in current events that affect the Muslim world with keen interest. With globalization and new initiatives in information technology, Muslims in Africa have developed and maintained close connections with the wider Muslim world. Analysts argue that Muslims in Africa, like other Muslims in Asia, the Middle East and the rest of the world, seem to be locked into an intense struggle regarding the future direction of Islam. At core of the struggle are questions about the way in which Muslims should practice the faith. The scholars assert that the majority seems to prefer to remain on the moderate, tolerant course that Islam has historically followed. However, a relatively small, but growing group would like to establish a stricter form of the religion, one that informs and controls all aspects of society. Sharia. The Sharia law broadly influences the legal code in most Islamic countries, but the extent of its impact varies widely. In Africa, most states limit the use of Sharia to personal status law for issues such as marriage, divorce, inheritance and child custody. With the exception of northern Nigeria, secularism does not seem to face any serious threat in Africa, even though the new Islamic revival is having a great impact upon segments of Muslim populations. Coexistence between Muslims and non-Muslims remains, for the most part, peaceful. Nigeria is home to Africa's largest Muslim population. In 1999, Nigeria's northern states adopted the Sharia penal code, but punishments have been rare. In fact, dozens of women convicted of adultery and sentenced to stoning to death have later been freed. Egypt, one of the largest Muslim states in Africa, claims Sharia as the main source of its legislation, yet its penal and civil codes are based largely on French law. Sect Muslims in Africa mostly belong to the Sunni denomination, although there are also a significant number of Shia's adherents. In addition, Sufism, the mystical dimension of Islam, has a presence. The Maliki madhab is the dominant school of jurisprudence amongst most of the continent's Sunni communities, while the Shafi'i madhab is prevalent in the Horn of Africa, eastern Egypt, and the Swahili coast. The Hanafi fiqh is also followed in western Egypt. Sufism, which focuses on the mystical elements of Islam, has many orders as well as followers in West Africa and Sudan, and, like other orders, strives to know God through meditation and emotion. Sufis may be Sunni or Shiite, and the ceremonies may involve chanting, music, dancing, and meditation. Many Sufis in Africa are syncretic, where they practice Sufism with traditional folklore beliefs. Salafis criticize the folklorist Sufis, who they claim have incorporated un-Islamic beliefs into the practices, such as celebrating the several events, visiting the shrines of Islamic saints, dancing during prayer. West Africa and Sudan have various Sufi orders regarded skeptically by the more doctrinally strict branches of Islam in the Middle East. Most orders in West Africa emphasize the role of a spiritual guide, Marabada, possessing supernatural power, regarded as an Africanization of Islam. In Senegal and Gambia, Mouridism Sufis claim to have several million adherents and have drawn criticism for the veneration of Mouridism's founder Ahmadou Bamba. The Tijani is the most popular Sufi order in West Africa, with a large following in Mauritania, Mali, Niger, Senegal and Gambia. Salafism. Relatively recently, Salafism has begun to spread in Africa, as a result of many Muslim non-governmental organizations such as the World Muslim League, the World Assembly for Muslim Youth, and the Federation of Mabund Islamic schools primarily funded by Salafi governments in the Middle East. These Salafist organizations, often based in Saudi Arabia, promote conservatism, and regard Sufi Islam as heterodox and contrary to the traditional Islam. Such NGOs have built Salafi-dominated mosques and Islamic centers in Africa, and many are staffed by puritanical African Muslims, often trained in the Middle East. Academic scholarships to study in Islamic universities in the Middle East are also offered to further Salafism. Notable kingdoms and sultanates.